In the early morning hours of May 14th, 1804, a group of men pushed away from the shores of Camp Dubois near St. Louis. They embarked on what would become one of the most ambitious expeditions in American history. A journey that would span 8,000 miles, cross uncharted territories, and transform a young nation's understanding of its western frontier. This is the story of the Corps of Discovery, the Lewis and Clark expedition. A tale of courage, perseverance, and discovery that forever changed America's relationship with its western lands. To understand the Lewis and Clark expedition, we must first understand the America of 1803, a young nation with grand ambitions but limited knowledge of its own geography. When Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801, the United States was largely confined to territories east of the Mississippi River. The vast lands beyond remained mysterious, unmapped by Americans, and populated by indigenous nations and European colonial outposts. Jefferson harbored a passionate curiosity about the Western territories. As a man of the Enlightenment, he was driven by scientific inquiry, but as president, he was equally motivated by national interests.
The interests of the United States would be more promoted by the possession of that country than any other which ever has or ever will come into their hands.
In January 1803, Jefferson requested $2,500 from Congress for an expedition to explore the Missouri River and find a route to the Pacific Ocean. The Louisiana Purchase was not yet on the horizon. This was, first and foremost, a mission of discovery. For this monumental task, Jefferson turned to his personal secretary, a 28-year-old Virginia-born soldier and frontiersman named Meriwether Lewis. Lewis embodied the frontier spirit Jefferson sought. Raised in the Virginia wilderness, Lewis had developed skills as a hunter and naturalist from an early age. He'd served in the militia during the Whiskey Rebellion and later in the regular army, rising to the rank of captain.
It was impossible to find a character who, to a complete science in botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy, joined the firmness of constitution and character, prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and familiarity with the Indian manners and character requisite for this undertaking.
To prepare for the expedition, Jefferson arranged for Lewis to receive crash courses in medicine, botany, zoology, and celestial navigation from the leading American scientists of the day. Lewis, recognizing the need for a co-commander, requested his former Army comrade William Clark join the expedition. Clark, 4 years older than Lewis, brought complementary skills to the partnership. He was an experienced cartographer and a natural leader of men. Clark had served with Lewis in the army, but had resigned his commission in 1796. Now he would return to service for what promised to be an epic journey. Then in the spring of 1803, as preparations continued, unexpected news arrived from France that would dramatically expand the scope of the expedition. Napoleon Bonaparte, facing military setbacks in Europe and the Caribbean, had offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million, about 4 cents per acre. The United States doubled its size overnight. The Louisiana Purchase added 828,000 square miles of territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Now Lewis and Clark would not just be exploring foreign territory, they would be surveying American land. Jefferson's instructions to Lewis expanded accordingly.
The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, whether the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or any other river, may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce.
Jefferson's instructions were comprehensive. The expedition was to document native tribes, wildlife, plants, geology, weather, and potential resources. They were to establish peaceful relations with indigenous nations and inform them of the change in territorial ownership. Throughout 1803, Lewis devoted himself to obtaining supplies and recruiting men. The list of equipment was extensive: weapons, tools, scientific instruments, medicines, and trade goods for Native American nations they would encounter. By December 1803, Lewis had joined Clark at Camp Dubois, near St. Louis. There they would spend the winter training their men, who became known as the Corps of Discovery. Corps of Discovery represented a unique American ensemble. At its core were the two captains, Lewis and Clark. Despite Jefferson's intention to make them co-commanders, Army regulations permitted only one captain. Lewis held the official rank, while Clark, though called captain by the men, was technically a lieutenant. The permanent party numbered about 33 men, including Sergeant Charles Floyd, who would be the expedition's only fatality; Sergeant Nathaniel Pryor, a trusted soldier who would later become an Indian agent; Sergeant John Ordway, whose detailed journal provides crucial insights into the journey; Private John Coulter, who would later become famous as a mountain man; George Drouillard, a skilled hunter and interpreter; York, Clark's enslaved servant, whose presence would fascinate many Native American tribes; and the 9 young men from Kentucky who formed the backbone of the Corps. The expedition also included a contingent of soldiers who would accompany them only as far as the Mandan villages in present-day North Dakota. Clark spent the winter months drilling the men, establishing discipline, and building the team mentality that would be essential for survival. Meanwhile, Lewis continued gathering intelligence about the territories ahead from traders and trappers who had ventured up the Missouri. The supplies they assembled reflected the multifaceted nature of their mission. They packed scientific instruments for mapping and wildlife documentation, medical supplies, weapons for hunting and defense, and trade goods to establish good relations with native nations. These trade goods were carefully selected to appeal to the various indigenous peoples they expected to encounter. Colored beads, brass buttons, mirrors, tomahawks that doubled as pipes, needles, and scissors. Their vessels were equally important. The primary boat was a 55-foot keelboat with a cabin, sail, and 22 oars. It would be accompanied by 2 pirogues, smaller, more maneuverable boats that could navigate shallower waters. By May 1804, the Corps was ready. On May 14th, they set off from Camp Dubois, embarking on a journey that would test their limits and carve their names into American history. The Missouri River presented immediate challenges. Its muddy waters concealed sandbars and snags that could damage or capsize their boats. Its current, powerful and unpredictable, fought against them with every stroke of the oar. The men often had to wade in the shallows, pulling the boats with ropes in a process called cordelling. The summer heat was oppressive. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, and injuries were common. Yet the landscape they traveled through was stunning. Clark, who served as the expedition's primary cartographer, noted in his journal the beauty of the prairies and woodlands along the river.
This prairie I called Butterfly Prairie, from the number of those insects which were in great quantities.
As they moved farther upstream, they began encountering Native American nations. On August 2nd, 1804, near present-day Sioux City, Iowa, they held the first of many formal councils with indigenous leaders. Lewis delivered a speech that he would repeat many times throughout the journey, announcing the change in territorial ownership and inviting the tribal leaders to form alliances with the United States.
Children, we have been sent by the great chief of the 17 great nations of America to inform you that your old fathers, the French and Spaniards, have gone beyond the Great Lake. the great chief of the 17 great nations of America, now extends his hand to you through us.
The speech reveals much about the expedition's diplomatic mission and its contradictions. While offering friendship and trade, Lewis was asserting American sovereignty over lands that had been home to indigenous peoples for countless generations. By late August, the expedition reached the territory of the Yankton Sioux in what is now southeastern South Dakota. The meeting went well, though Lewis and Clark were beginning to understand the complex relationships and occasional conflicts between the different native nations of the region. Not all encounters were peaceful. In late September, as they approached the territory of the Lakota Sioux, tensions flared. During a council meeting, a miscommunication led to a standoff. Clark and several men drew their weapons, while hundreds of Lakota warriors surrounded them. After tense negotiations, the situation was resolved, but it highlighted the fragile nature of diplomacy in this vast territory where different cultures, languages, and interests collided. As they continued northward, the men marveled at the abundance of wildlife. Lewis, fulfilling his role as naturalist, documented species previously unknown to Western science, including the pronghorn antelope, the prairie dog, and the coyote.
The antelope are extremely fleet and shy animals, and they possess the finest of all cloven-footed animals. They have only 2 hooves on each foot, are of a pale reddish-brown color, with a white spot on the rump.
By October, as temperatures dropped and ice began forming on the river, the expedition reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. Here, they would build their winter quarters, which they named Fort Mandan. The Mandan villages were bustling centers of trade in the northern plains. Lewis and Clark were impressed by the agricultural prowess and permanent settlements of these tribes. The 5 months at Fort Mandan proved crucial for the expedition. They built relationships with the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, gathering valuable information about the territories ahead. They also met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader who was living among the Hidatsa, and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Sacagawea was pregnant when they met her. Born among the Shoshone in present-day Idaho, she had been captured as a child by Hidatsa raiders and eventually became one of Charbonneau's wives. Her knowledge of Shoshone language and territory would prove invaluable as the expedition headed west. The winter at Fort Mandan was brutally cold, with temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero. The men hunted, processed meat, repaired equipment, and prepared for the next phase of their journey. Lewis worked on his scientific documentation, while Clark refined his maps. When spring arrived, the expedition prepared for significant changes. The keelboat would return to St. Louis, carrying specimens, maps, reports, and some of the soldiers who had accompanied them this far. From this point forward, the permanent party would continue in the 2 pirogues and 6 newly constructed canoes. On February 11, 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, whom Clark nicknamed Pompey. The infant would accompany the expedition for the entirety of its journey. On April 7, 1805, the Corps of Discovery left Fort Mandan and ventured into territories largely unknown to Americans. The most challenging and unpredictable part of their journey lay ahead. As the Corps moved westward from Fort Mandan, the landscape began to change dramatically. The familiar woodlands gave way to open plains, and eventually the striking formations of the North Dakota Badlands. The wildlife grew even more plentiful. The expedition encountered vast herds of buffalo, elk, and antelope. Lewis's journal entries from this period are filled with detailed descriptions of the animals they observed.
The buffalo and elk are in great abundance. The buffalo, elk, and antelope are so gentle that we pass near them while feeding, without appearing to excite any alarm among them.
They also encountered a species they had been warned about by Native American informants, the grizzly bear. Unlike the black bears of the East, grizzlies often stood their ground when confronted.
I find that the curiosity of our party is pretty well satisfied with respect to this animal. I had rather fight 2 Indians than 1 bear.
By late April, they reached the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, in what is now western North Dakota. Here, they sent a small group to explore the Yellowstone while the main party continued along the Missouri. In early May, the expedition entered present-day Montana. The river grew more challenging, with strong currents and rocky obstacles. The men were now pulling the boats upstream against a powerful current, sometimes covering less than 20 miles in a day of exhausting labor. Yet the landscape rewarded their efforts. In late May, they reached an area now known as the White Cliffs of the Missouri, where spectacular sandstone formations rose from the riverbanks.
The hills and river cliffs which we passed today exhibit a most romantic appearance. As we passed on, it seemed as if those scenes of visionary enchantment would never have an end.
By early June, they faced one of the greatest challenges of their journey, the Great Falls of the Missouri. This series of 5 waterfalls stretched over a distance of about 10 miles, with a total drop of nearly 400 feet.
I beheld the grand and majestic spectacle which had never before been viewed by civilized man.
Lewis's statement overlooked the many indigenous peoples who had lived near and traveled past these falls for countless generations. But it reflected his sense that the expedition was venturing into territories unmapped by Americans. To continue their journey, the Corps needed to portage around the falls, a grueling process that took nearly a month. They constructed crude wagons to carry the boats and equipment over rough terrain, battling prickly pear cactus that pierced their moccasins, violent hailstorms, and swarms of mosquitoes.
The men are all becoming much weakened with the immense labors they have undergone. Their feet are also becoming sore.
During this time, Lewis attempted to assemble a collapsible iron boat frame that he had brought from the east. Covered with animal hides, it was meant to replace one of the pirogues. But the experiment failed when they couldn't find suitable materials to seal the hides, forcing them to build a new wooden canoe instead. By late July, they reached the 3 forks of the Missouri River. Lewis named them after President Jefferson, Secretary of State James Madison, and Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin, a reminder of the political dimensions of this scientific expedition. They were now approaching Shoshone territory, where Sacagawea had been born. Finding the Shoshone had become critical to their mission. They needed horses to cross the mountains that lay ahead. Lewis, growing impatient, took a small party ahead to try to locate the Shoshone. On August 12, 1805, near Lemhi Pass on what is now the Montana-Idaho border, Lewis became the first American to cross the Continental Divide.
The road took us to the most distant fountain of the waters of the mighty Missouri.
But what Lewis saw beyond the divide was not what he had hoped for. Instead of a gentle slope leading to a navigable river, he beheld more mountains, rugged snow-capped peaks that stretched to the horizon.
I discovered to my mortification that the distance which those mountains extended was much further than I expected.
After several days of searching, Lewis finally encountered a small group of Shoshone men. Using sign language and gifts, he convinced them to accompany him back to the main party where Sacagawea could translate. When Clark arrived with the main party, an extraordinary coincidence was revealed. The Shoshone chief, Kameawait, was Sacagawea's brother. Their reunion was emotional, though both maintained their composure in keeping with Shoshone custom.
The meeting of those people was really affecting, particularly between Sacagawea and an Indian woman, who had been taken prisoner at the same time with her, and who had afterwards escaped from the Minnetarees and rejoined her nation.
This fortunate connection helped Lewis and Clark secure the horses they desperately needed. The captains traded guns, ammunition, and trade goods for horses, and hired a Shoshone guide named Old Toby. With horses to carry their supplies, the Corps abandoned their canoes and began the difficult journey across the Bitterroot Mountains, part of the Rockies. This would prove to be the most physically challenging segment of their entire expedition. In September 1805, they crossed the mountains along what is now known as the Lolo Trail. It was a brutal passage. Snow fell, game became scarce, and the men were reduced to eating their remaining portable soup, candles, and eventually some of their horses.
I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Indeed, I was at one time fearful my feet would freeze in the thin moccasins which I wore.
By late September, starving and exhausted, they emerged from the mountains and encountered the Nez Perce tribe. Once again, the Corps was dependent on indigenous hospitality for their survival. The Nez Perce provided food and helped them construct new canoes to continue their journey by water. With new canoes, they navigated down the Clearwater River to the Snake, and then to the mighty Columbia River. After months of traveling upstream against the current of the Missouri, they were now moving with the flow, though the Columbia presented its own dangers in the form of rapids and falls. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote his famous line,
"Ocean in view, oh the joy."
Though they had not yet actually reached the Pacific, they could sense its proximity. It would take nearly 2 more weeks of navigating the Columbia's estuary before they truly reached the ocean. By mid-November, the Corps of Discovery had accomplished the first half of their mission. They had reached the Pacific Ocean, establishing that a water route across the continent, while not continuous, was possible. Now they needed to survive the winter and make the return journey. The Corps had reached the Pacific, but their situation remained precarious. Winter was approaching, they were low on supplies, and they needed to establish a secure location for the coming months. After exploring both sides of the Columbia River estuary, they held a democratic vote to decide where to spend the winter, a vote in which both Sacagawea and York, Clark's enslaved servant, participated. They chose a site on the south side of the Columbia, in present-day Oregon, and began building Fort Clatsop, named after the local Clatsop tribe. Construction began on December 7th and was completed by Christmas Day, 1805. The winter at Fort Clatsop was miserable. Pacific Northwest winters are notoriously wet, and the winter of 1805 to 1806 was particularly soggy. In their journals, Lewis and Clark noted that it rained all but 12 days of their entire stay.
Oh, how disagreeable is our situation during this dreadful weather.
Despite the conditions, the Corps remained productive. The captains spent considerable time updating their journals and maps. Lewis documented the flora and fauna of the region, while the men hunted, processed salt from seawater, and prepared for the return journey. They also interacted with local indigenous peoples, including the Clatsop and Chinook tribes. These coastal nations were experienced traders, having dealt with European and American ships for years.
They are great higglers in trade, and if they conceive you anxious to purchase will be a whole day bargaining for a handful of roots.
This somewhat critical assessment reflected cultural differences in trading practices, but also the Corps' increasing dependence on indigenous peoples for food and information. In January, hearing of a beached whale south of Fort Clatsop, a party including Sacagawea and Clark traveled to the site. By the time they arrived, local tribes had already harvested most of the whale, but Clark managed to purchase some blubber, which was a welcome addition to their monotonous diet of elk meat. By March 1806, anxious to begin their return journey, the Corps decided they could wait no longer for trading vessels to arrive. On March 23rd, they gave Fort Clatsop to the Clatsop Chief Cobowe and began their journey eastward. The return journey would follow a somewhat different route. Based on information from Indigenous informants, they planned to take shortcuts where possible and explore additional territories. The early stages of the return were challenging. Spring runoff had swollen the Columbia River, making the upstream journey difficult. Food scarcity remained a problem, and they were forced to trade tools and other equipment for provisions. Near present-day The Dalles, Oregon, they abandoned their canoes and procured horses to continue overland. Their route took them through the territories of several tribes, including the Walla Walla, whose chief, Yelept, warmly welcomed them. Throughout April and early May, they received crucial guidance from various Indigenous peoples about mountain passes and potential shortcuts. Near present-day Kamaya, Idaho, however, they found their path blocked by snow in the Bitterroot Mountains. Forced to camp with the Nez Perce for nearly a month while waiting for the mountain snow to melt, the Corps built strong relationships with their hosts. Lewis practiced medicine, treating various ailments, while Clark practiced diplomacy. By mid-June, with Nez Perce guides leading them, they successfully crossed the mountains. Once back on the eastern side of the Continental Divide, the captains decided to split the expedition temporarily to explore more territory. Lewis took a group northward to explore the Marias River watershed in northern Montana, while Clark headed southeast toward the Yellowstone River. They planned to reunite at the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. Lewis's detour led to the expedition's only violent encounter with Native Americans. On July 27, 1806, his small party met a group of Blackfeet warriors. Initially, the meeting was peaceful, but overnight, the Blackfeet attempted to steal the expedition's guns and horses.
Being alarmed in an instant, I reached to seize my gun and saw the Indian making off with it. I ran at him with my pistol and bid him lay down my gun, which he was in the act of doing when the fielder fired, and he fell.
In the ensuing struggle, 2 Blackfeet men were killed. Lewis and his men immediately gathered their equipment and rode hard for a full day, covering over 100 miles to escape potential retaliation. Meanwhile, Clark's group had a less dramatic journey down the Yellowstone River. They built canoes and enjoyed relatively easy travel, though they too had horses stolen by Indigenous raiders. On August 12, 1806, the two groups reunited. Despite missing each other at the planned meeting point, Clark had left a note, and Lewis's group caught up with them downstream. After more than a month apart, the Corps was whole again. With the Corps reunited, they made rapid progress down the Missouri. Their knowledge of the river, coupled with its downstream current, allowed them to cover 70 or more miles per day. On August 14th, they reached the Mandan villages, where they had spent the winter of 1804 to 1805. Here, they said goodbye to Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and their now 18-month-old son, Jean-Baptiste. Clark, who had grown fond of the boy, offered to provide for his education when he was older, a promise he would later fulfill. The final stretch of their journey was relatively uneventful. On September 23, 1806, after 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, the Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis.
We were met by all the village and received a hearty welcome from its inhabitants.
The men who had been presumed dead by many had returned, bearing maps, specimens, and stories from their epic journey across the continent and back. The Lewis and Clark expedition transformed America's understanding of its western territories and accelerated the nation's westward expansion. Their detailed maps and reports provided practical information for future travelers, traders, and settlers. Scientifically, the expedition was groundbreaking. Lewis and Clark documented at least 178 plant species and 122 animal species previously unknown to Western science, though of course well known to the indigenous peoples who had lived with them for generations. Geopolitically, the expedition strengthened American claims to the Oregon Territory, setting the stage for eventual U.S. control of the Pacific Northwest. The information they gathered about the complexity of indigenous political relationships and trade networks helped shape U.S. Indian policy for decades. For the indigenous nations who assisted the Corps, the expedition's legacy is more complicated. Many of the tribes who helped Lewis and Clark survive would, within decades, face displacement, disease, and warfare as American settlers pushed westward. As for the members of the Corps themselves, their fates were varied. Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of Louisiana Territory, but struggled in the role. On October 11, 1809, he died of gunshot wounds along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. While officially ruled a suicide, questions about his death persist. William Clark had a distinguished post-expedition career, serving as Superintendent of Indian Affairs and Governor of Missouri Territory. He lived until 1838, maintaining his relationship with Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau and even raising Sacagawea's second son Lisette after her death. Sacagawea's fate is debated by historians. Some evidence suggests she died at Fort Manuel in present-day South Dakota around 1812. However, oral traditions among the Shoshone and Comanche suggest she may have returned to her people and lived until 1884. York, Clark's enslaved servant, requested his freedom after the expedition, having experienced relative equality during the journey. Clark initially refused, though some evidence suggests York may have eventually gained his freedom years later. The expedition's most tangible legacy lies in its documentation. The journals kept by Lewis, Clark, and several other Corps members provide an invaluable record of early 19th century America, its landscapes, wildlife, indigenous cultures, and the complex process of national expansion. Today, much of their route is preserved as the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, stretching 4,900 miles from Wood River, Illinois, to the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon. Visitors can follow in their footsteps, experiencing landscapes that in some places remain remarkably similar to what the Corps encountered. The indigenous nations whose ancestors met Lewis and Clark continue to preserve their cultures and histories, offering perspectives that complement and sometimes challenge the narrative found in the expedition journals. The Corps of Discovery's journey reminds us of the power of human endurance, the importance of cross-cultural cooperation, and the complex legacy of exploration. Their expedition forever changed America's relationship with its Western territories, opening new chapters in the ongoing story of the American West. From the muddy banks of the Missouri to the crashing waves of the Pacific, Lewis and Clark's journey spanned a continent and captured the imagination of a young nation. Their expedition was not just a tale of discovery, but a complex human drama involving dozens of indigenous nations, a diverse corps of explorers, and the natural world they all inhabited. As we reflect on their remarkable journey, we're reminded that the story of Lewis and Clark is not just about two men, but about a diverse ensemble of characters. Indigenous guides, French-Canadian interpreters, American soldiers, and the landscapes themselves, all playing critical roles in a journey that would transform a nation's understanding of its possibilities as well as its responsibilities.